Hi, this is How to Write a Philosophy Paper, Part 2. If you're watching this video first, you want to go back and watch Part 1 instead. Okay, in this video, I'm going to begin by talking about the different parts of a philosophy paper again, so that we can see what we've covered and what we're going to cover in this video. Then, I'm going to talk about how to write a response to your objection. Then, how to write a reply to your response. And finally, how to write the conclusion for this paper. Then, I'll go through some tips. Okay, so to go through the parts of a philosophy paper again so that we understand where we are in the process. First is the introduction, and then the presentation of an argument. Then, an objection, and here I want you to include making the case for the objection and what effect the objection will have on the argument. Then, in this video, I'm going to talk about how to write a response to your objection, a reply to the response to your objection, and the conclusion. At the heart of what we're trying to do in philosophy class is realizing that there are objections to every single view that we could hold, and also that there are responses to these objections. So this is actually how it is we get our views to be better and stronger, is by considering how it is you might object to your view and then how you can respond to it. So that's what we're doing in this part of the paper. One way, as I've said, to realize that the importance of this process is by sort of having the opportunity to work through it. And this is what I hope this paper will give you. In addition, it's important that you present a serious response to your objection. Actually try to get into the mind of a person who doesn't like the objection that you presented and try to figure out how to respond to it. Okay. Now that's how you respond to the objection that you presented. In your reply to the response to the objection, you can either argue that the response to the objection works, and so the objection fails, and in this case, as a result, the original argument that you're considering is defended or considered to be good, or you can argue that the response to the objection fails, and so the objection that you came up with is good, and this means that the original argument fails or is no good. Now here, I don't simply want you to say that there's no possible reply to the response to this objection. If that's true, what you need to do is explain what effect that has on the original argument. And I think that whether you're considering an objection or a response to an objection or a reply to this response, there's always something you can come up with. You should never find yourself at a complete dead end. Okay, writing the conclusion of a philosophy paper. Conclusions are as boring as introductions. What I want you to do is begin by explaining what you just did in the paper. This will be very similar to the introduction, but at the end. Also, I want you to conclude with a sentence or two reflecting on what you discovered throughout this process. You'll see a little bit more about what I mean in my example that's coming up, but I want you to just sort of think about what you learned by working through this exercise and sort of summarize this in a sentence or two and put it at the end of your paper. So here's an example of a conclusion of the paper we were considering earlier using my silly ontological argument for a perfect Big Mac. This is what I mean when I say explain exactly what you did in the paper. Conclusion. In this paper, I first presented Nick's ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac. Then, I objected to the fourth premise. Next, I presented a response to this objection, and finally a reply to this response, arguing that the original objection is good, and so the argument fails. When I first read Nick's argument, I thought that there was something funny about its conclusion that the perfect Big Mac must exist. I realized that part of the problem was that just because I can imagine a Big Mac than which none greater can be thought, this should not mean that this Big Mac exists both in my understanding and in reality. Interestingly, this process also taught me about Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, an argument that I always struggled to understand before. So, this is the part of the conclusion where you explain exactly what happened in the paper, and this is the part where you reflect on what you learned. Okay, a few tips for writing philosophy papers. First of all, there shouldn't be any reason to cite anything other than possibly the page numbers from the readings. Now, I'm not really a stickler for this. If you're just using the arguments from the videos and you're not really using the text, there's no reason to cite the page numbers. But if you're digging deep into the text and you're citing something outside the arguments, which is certainly possible, I would, in that case, encourage you to use the page numbers. In the case where you're using the quotation page numbers from the book, just as I did there in the like this, put them in parentheses. So, no big deal. I encourage you not to find any other sources for this paper. You shouldn't need to cite anything else. I encourage you not to go out to the internet looking for objections. The internet is kind of a crazy place when it comes to philosophy. There are some very, very good resources, and there are also some things that appear to be good that are awful. So, I encourage you to just come up with your own objections. This is actually one of the really interesting times, I think, in your college education where you can do everything for this class in your mind, right? I just want you to think about what you don't like about the argument and put that into the paper, and then try to figure out how someone could respond to that, and then try to figure out how someone could reply to that response. This is one of the few opportunities, I think, where what I care about is you working through this process and how you go through it, right? So there's no need to cite anything other than perhaps the page numbers from the readings. Now, I also encourage you to spend some time brainstorming before you begin writing the paper, so you know exactly what part of the argument you're going to object to and how you're going to object, as well as how you might respond to this objection and how you can reply to this response. As I've said a few times, I would personally write the introduction and the conclusion last, although I don't think that there's anything wrong with sketching out each step that you're going to take so that you don't forget it. But in my experience, it's actually easier to just start with the argument, get that right, figure out your objection, figure out a response to your objection, and then figure out your reply, write all of that, and then write the introduction and the conclusion last. Of course, it's up to you. Okay, now, in the paper, you can feel free to be obnoxious, or combative, or contrarian, or you can just be none of these and write a straight paper. It doesn't matter to me, and I don't matter. It also doesn't matter to me what you argue for and how you argue, as long as it is reasonable. What matters is that you clearly present the argument and that you clearly present each part of the paper and correctly work through the process. So I'm not saying here that you can write gibberish, and as long as it looks like it fits, it will work. That is not going to be okay. But what I'm saying is that if you would like to be obnoxious somehow, or combative, or contrarian, if these are things that you enjoy, by all means, write the paper in this way. Of course, you don't have to be any of those things. You can just write a regular paper if you want. Also, extra stuff to fill space is not good. There's a lot of steps in this paper, and there is no reason to do anything extra just to fill space. I will be able to see right through this, and I find it very irritating. So don't do it. In support of this, I don't care how long your paper is, okay? I think that it will take at least 2.5 to 3 pages to write it well. I suppose that if you are very, very good and lucky, you might be able to get it in 1.5 pages. I certainly am not challenging you to do that. I'm just saying that it's possible, okay? So, given this, that you could potentially do it in 1.5 pages, I do not want you to add extra stuff to fill space, because I don't care how long the paper is as long as you fulfill all the requirements. Okay? Good. And this last piece, if there's some things that you want to say, but they didn't really fit into the paper, you can feel free to include an appendix. Just call it Appendix 1, and you can write anything else you would like in that, that you didn't get to put in the paper, but that you want to say. Now, the appendix won't be included in your grade, but sometimes students have extra things that they want to say that don't fit into the paper, and I encourage them to feel free to say them, but don't put them in the paper. So this is your place for doing that. Of course, you don't need an appendix. You only have to do this if you feel there are some things that you want to say that you didn't get the opportunity to. Okay. Now, notice, as I've said a couple of times, you don't have to personally agree with any of the things that you argue for in this paper. I think that that's one of the really interesting things about philosophy papers, is it gives us the opportunity to just explore ideas. The point, as I've said, is to work through the process of objecting to an argument, responding to this objection, and then replying to this response. Your personal views can be separate from all of this. And I think that this is a really excellent opportunity to sort of separate ourselves from our personal views and to interact with them just as ideas, right? So maybe I really fiercely believe that God doesn't exist. But this can give me the opportunity to think about some arguments for the other side. Similarly, maybe I really fiercely believe that God does exist. This can give me some opportunities to think about some arguments against this position, and what possible replies to them might be, and what responses to those replies might look like. I think that this is a very excellent opportunity, and again, it doesn't matter to me where you end up. All that matters to me is that you carefully work through the process. So, obviously I cannot take your questions as I'm recording the video, but this week I will put up a discussion board to take any questions, and I will be watching it very closely. So let me know if there's anything additional that you need from me. Your main focus this week is going to be on reviewing the material and writing the paper. I will also post a review video. And one of the early assignments this week is going to be submitting the presenting the argument part of this paper for my feedback. And I'm doing this because if this part of the paper is not set up right, the whole rest of the paper is not going to work. So I'm going to do that, and I want you to spend most of the week working on your paper. As always, I'm available if you have any questions. Good luck with everything.